Now we're going to move on to our award presentation. MAAWG gives 2 awards every year. One, which we gave out in Dublin in June, is the Mary Latinsky Award. That is intended to be a sort of a lifetime achievement award. The other award that we give out is one that is very special to me. That is the J.D. Phalke Award. In 2011, the world lost a champion and dedicated anti-spammer who spent his life making the internet a safer place for everyone. This award, in honor of J.D. Phalke's work and memory, seeks to recognize people who are committed to a better online world and protecting end users from all forms of messaging abuse. The award seeks to recognize the efforts for a particular meritorious item of work rather than recognizing a lifetime of achievement. The specific categories, the specific criteria we tend to look for here are things like volunteerism and community building and collaboration, as those were really the attributes that JD specifically brought to MAAWG. At this time, I would like to turn the podium over to Dave Crocker, Senior Technical Advisor, for the award presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. So, the community orientation and community building that JD had, as Mike mentioned, was complemented by another feature that I especially enjoyed about him, and since it's such a contrast with my own style, and that was that he could pursue and raise challenging topics constructively in an unchallenging style. And this made the topics something that we could consider in a reasonable way with less of the furor than often comes with the topics this community has to deal with. One of the great joys of dealing with MAAWG for me is being on the awards committee and participating in the selection. And the award this year for the J.D. Phalke Award it is to an entire team of people who, in my view, very much in the style of J.D., pursued a topic of quite a bit of controversy in a way that was focused on the substance and not the emotion, and in a way that is representative of a challenge that technicians have in participating in public policy discussions. The single biggest role that technicians can have, I was taught a long time ago, when there is policy or the like to discuss, is to make sure that the technical issues are made very clear in a way that it can be consumed by non-technicians, so that the discussion surrounding the policy can be built upon a foundation of accurate technical information. And so this year, MAAWG is very pleased, and I am feeling very privileged to announce that the award is the 15 co-authors of the paper Keys Under Doormats, Mandating Insecurity by Requiring Governments Access to All Data and Communications. Accepting, hold on just a second. Now, accepting on behalf of his 14 co-authors is Josh Benelo, and I'll put this slide up because I wanted to actually read everyone's names, but it was pointed out to me that would take a while. And so we are providing a slide with names and titles, but I will only go into detail about Josh's background, which is interesting in several ways. Josh is a senior cryptographer at Microsoft Research, and he has bachelor's and a master's and PhDs all in the areas you'd expect, but he also has a master's in philosophy from MIT. And in the realm of dealing with the world of politics, I was intrigued to note that one of the other items on his resume is that he has recently been chair of the Citizen Oversight Panel for the Seattle Region's Sound Transit Agency, which is spending $1 billion a year on improvements. And so on behalf of MAAWG,
quite heavy,
it is.
but beautiful.
Over here. All right.
Indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And for me, and on behalf of all of my 14 co-authors, I do thank you very much. I believe that I never had the honor of actually getting to meet J.D. Falk. I have to say it that way because I have an embarrassingly atrocious memory for people and names. But from what I've been told, if I had ever met him, I would remember it. He's that sort of a person. So the loss is mine. Let me get this plugged in, and hopefully we will have a bit of a presentation. Yes? Yes, good. Okay. So anyway, we have 15 authors on this report. You will hear from most of them this morning, and still have time for lunch, I hope. I want to first start off, though, by having a couple of videos, and the very first one by Danny Whitener. Danny describes himself as the instigating author, and he is that and much more. And I'll say a little bit more about Danny in a minute. But first, I'd like to cue the video from Danny, if we can.
Thanks very much for this J.D. Phalke Award. It's really an honor to receive it from MAAWG. I've always been a huge admirer of your work and really appreciate the way you guys have been able to get together and collaborate and solve hard problems. The internet is really a better place for what you all do. What I hope the policy community can take away from our report is certainly that there are no silver bullets, there are no golden keys to solving law enforcement problems. But beyond that, there's a larger technology policy context that we have to address. We can't just focus on building exceptional access systems. We also have to worry about who's going to be able to use them. Are the countries where they're going to be deployed have adequate rule of law and real protection for human rights? Democratic countries that respect the rule of law and try to protect human rights have always recognized that as law enforcement surveillance capabilities increase, and they certainly are today, we have to also increase privacy protections to make sure that we're respecting human rights and providing adequate accountability for the increased powers that law enforcement have. To me, this report is part of a really long tradition of the cryptography and security community being engaged in public policy questions, helping countries all around the world deal with important questions like the security of voting systems and the security properties of other infrastructures that we really care about. This report is part of a long tradition in the security and cryptography community of bringing outstanding technical expertise to important social problems. Everything from the security of voting systems to questions about surveillance to the security of our critical infrastructures. I'm especially happy that this report is the first project of a new initiative that we have at MIT, the MIT Internet Policy Research Initiative, where we'll be continuing to work on a number of these issues with the whole community. We're looking forward to the chance to work together more with all of you here, and thanks again for this award.
Okay, thanks from Danny, for Danny. And next I'd like to hear from Steve Bellavin, who hosted us for our face-to-face meeting at Columbia and is, of course, a very well-known security expert.
Thank you all for honoring us. I'm quite touched by this very unexpected honor. We did it not for awards or recognition, but because we're all committed to trying to secure the internet, and we regard these schemes for exceptional access as a serious threat to that. Something that I don't think I need to explain to you, but is very hard to convey to people who are not in the computer business, is the system's nature of security, that all pieces of the system contribute. The colloquial phrase is a chain is as strong as its weakest link. The same is true for security. You don't go through strong security, you go around it. Adding provisions for exceptional access adds complexity, weakens the links, and inevitably weakens the system. Again, thank you for honoring us.
Thank you, Steve. So 20 years ago, the internet was at something of an inflection point. It was moving from academia to homes and offices. We had new technology, like browsers, come about that people started to become familiar with. And a nascent industry of e-commerce. But in order to provide e-commerce, we needed security. People wanted to buy things, people needed to send credit cards, and security was becoming important in the internet when it hadn't been a major consideration up until then. Well, 20 years earlier, cryptography had made a similar transition. It had been, before that, in the venue of the military, almost entirely. But 20 years before this time, 40 years ago roughly, the data encryption standard was published. The Diffie-Hellman New Directions paper was published. Right on its heels, the RSA, Public Key Crypto System, came out. And there was a flourish of activity in cryptography in the academic world. But it had been academic until this time when the internet was starting to move and e-commerce was calling for it, and it hit the mainstream at that point. Now, at that time, cryptography still had the legacy of coming from the military. It was classified as a munition. To export anything that had cryptography in it required an arms dealer's license. I remember that early in my time at Microsoft, we had a crypto stress test lab. The label on the door was the munitions testing lab. And this made things difficult. If we wanted to export something with simple cryptography, it was very hard. And we were allowed with difficulty to export weak cryptography. Strong cryptography wasn't allowed at all. Even though it was completely available overseas, you could describe how to do it on a t-shirt, you could not export a product that had strong cryptography. You could not even export a product that had a button that said encrypt and leave it to the other end, to the importer, to plug in the cryptography underneath. Crypto with a hole, as it was called, was not exportable. So in that climate, and still with the military tradition, the NSA put forward the Clipper chip. Some of you may remember the Clipper chip. This was a technology that was put in phones that enabled encryption of telephone communications, but at the same time allowed law enforcement to get access and listen to the communications. There was a special key that was available to the appropriate listeners. Well, this created a big battle. Industry was not very happy with this in general, and after a couple of years of fighting and some flaws found in the Clipper design, and a lot of publicity from companies like RSA, Clipper did finally sink. But the difficulties of actually building and using good cryptography were still there. The export restrictions were still in place, and they were used as kind of a club to prevent strong cryptography from being deployed. Because even though there weren't any domestic restrictions, if you wanted your product to be able to be sold internationally, to be compatible, it was very difficult to have a domestic version that was strong and an export version that was weak. And after all, who would buy the weak version? You know, it made sales very difficult. So effectively, because of export controls, we only had weak crypto in the world, crypto that was fairly easily broken. Even though strong cryptography was available worldwide. So in that climate, the National Research Council, among others, published a report somewhat bombastically titled the Crisis Report, but still a very important and valuable contribution. Talking, among other things, about the economic harm of the US not being able to sell this technology, which could be sold by other countries and imported into the US. This was harming severely some industries that were growing and might be snuffed out by this rule. So in this climate, the Clinton administration did have some changes. President Clinton issued an executive order transferring control of export of cryptography from the Defense Department to the Commerce Department. And it became easier, but it was still only weak cryptography that could be exported. And in that climate, we still faced a lot of difficulties. And we still wanted to be able to build strong cryptography into our products, and we had a lot of good reasons for doing that. And the Center for Democracy and Technology assembled a group of 11 experts to write a report that was known at the time as the Risks Report, or the Crypto Experts Risks Report, or something like that, that talked about the technological side of these restrictions and the technological difficulty in building in the kind of key recovery, key escrow systems that law enforcement seemed to be requesting at the time. Now, even though this was there, at that time there was a lot of debate and consideration, and eventually the Clinton administration in 2000 did relax the restrictions and allow the export of strong cryptography. There were still administrative restrictions and paperwork that had to be done, but things flourished at that time. We were able to actually build in good security, export it pretty much all around the world. Things were much better for most. Now, law enforcement at that time had argued that this was going to be a terrible thing, that with strong cryptography available everywhere, communications would go dark, that they wouldn't be able to conduct surveillance. But as we've learned since, the era since 2000 has been a golden age for surveillance, that there have been many, many more opportunities. Communications, which were mostly voice in 2000, have become mostly text, either email or SMS or instant messaging or other mechanisms which are much easier to track. And people seem to walk around with these little homing devices just about everywhere they go, which is very nice for law enforcement in many ways. There have been many, many advantages that law enforcement has had, and they have had really a golden age of access to data that they'd never had before, and access to information. And this was largely unappreciated by the public. The public was pretty happy with the way things were going. And that seemed to be the case and continue until a couple of years ago when something seemed to change. And I don't know what, but I might be able to guess. And suddenly this hit the public consciousness. There was more of a sense that maybe things have gone a little too far. We kind of like our privacy, please. And within that, companies started listening. Now, most people here work in industry, and you probably know that companies sometimes do listen to their own experts, listen to people in this room, but they almost always listen to their customers. And customers were saying, we want better privacy, we want protection here, the surveillance has gone too far. And companies started building strong cryptography into products where it hadn't been before. Now, at this point, law enforcement agencies got very uncomfortable. Now, I don't want to be glib about this. There really is a good case to be made for law enforcement. There's a whole spectrum of views from complete privacy in everything to a complete police state, and reasonable people can differ on where on the spectrum things should fall. But there was a very strong reaction from law enforcement that we are going dark. The echoes of what we heard in 2000 and before that. Things must be changed. Requirements must be put in. And within this context, in February, our instigating author, Danny, who was behind the scenes at the Center for Democracy and Technology in our 1997 report, sent a note to all of us saying, hey, we might need to revise this. Bring it up to date, see what's out there new, and see if we need to make some changes and get back into the public debate, because this is becoming a concern again. So we all said great, and then I had my own personal panic moment, because I took a look at the list of authors. And when we did this back in 1997, we had about half of us were from industry, about half of us were from academia. The idea was to have a broad spectrum. And it just so happened, purely by chance, that all of the authors who had been in industry, except for me, are now in academia. So I looked and said, oh no, Microsoft may stick out like a sore thumb on this. Management might not be happy with this. I've got to check and get approval. And I sent a note up the chain, and to my happiness, very quickly I got back a response saying, this is the right side of the issue, this is the issue where we want to be, and this was from very high up in the organization. And if we're alone on this, so be it. So all was good. I was able to continue. I was very happy about that. As I mentioned, Steve Bellevin hosted a meeting in May at Columbia. Most of us were there, maybe not most, many of us were there in person. Others were there remotely. We discussed things, we kicked things around quite a lot. After that meeting, we really did look very seriously at ways of trying to meet law enforcement needs. And we eventually came up with our conclusion that we just don't know how to provide law enforcement the access they seek without weakening the already fragile internet. That's our basic conclusion, and it goes further than that, and saying that we don't believe that it's possible with the current infrastructure and current technology. Maybe if we tore down the internet and built it again from scratch, we could do that, but that's not an option. We have to play with the cards we've been dealt, and we don't think there's a way to do it. If we're wrong, great. If somebody can find a way, great, but we don't think it's possible. So I want to now hear from a couple of the other authors on the basic conclusion. I want to start with Peter Neumann, who is also a very well-known security expert at SRI. So if we can get Peter, please.
In the last century, the so-called crypto wars involved the US government wanting to dumb down the flow of crypto across the world and to provide access to keys that they could get at that nobody else could. At that time, I said that Pandora's cat is out of the barn and the genie won't go back in the closet. I think we now have in this century the new cryptography wars, where the intelligence folks want to have access to the keys under circumstances that only they can control. The law enforcement folks can't deal with keys. They want the plain text, the unencrypted stuff. The Indian government wants access to everything and controlling everything. And the UK's David Cameron was the guy who said that he wanted to ban all cryptography. Clearly, he had no understanding of what the implications of that would be. In today's world, we have almost all of the systems that are attached to the internet are easily broken or have been broken. All of the corporations and even the government itself really need systems that are much more trustworthy than we have today. So we're stuck in the middle between the idea of dumbing down the security for the aforementioned people, governments and so on, or greatly increasing it to ensure that our digital commerce and our national critical infrastructures and so on are in fact adequately protected. The bottom line here is that there is no reasonable middle ground between the dumbing down that results from having selected access by selected people that can't be employed by anybody else, which seems to be relatively impossible, versus the need for having secure systems for everybody. Thank you.
All right. Next, we have Bruce Schneier, who is a private security consultant and author, has written many books, widely distributed.
When the government asks for backdoor access into a security system, what they're wanting is an access system that only works for them, that criminals can't use, that bad guys can't use. But I can't build that. I can't build a technological access system that only works in the presence of a certain legal document, or for people with a certain morality, or people who get a paycheck from a certain government organization. I can only build a technological access system that works for people with the right technological access. And what that means is that any access system has to have an entire other security system around it, primarily a procedural system that tries to ensure that only the right people get that access. And we know that fails. Right? We know as soon as we build a system that allows all sorts of third-party access, that third parties we don't want are going to use it. And basically, I can build a technological system where either everyone gets to spy or no one gets to spy. Right? That is secure for all users, or that is vulnerable to all attackers. Right? That's the problem with what the FBI is wanting. I can build a system where the FBI can break in and get to the plaintext even if the conversants don't want them to. But I can't build a system that allows only them to do it.
Okay, and next we have Jeff Schiller, who's part of our very large MIT contingent on this effort, and has also done tremendous research on system security. So when you're ready, Jeff, please.
A door is a door, and all a door needs to be opened is a key, whether that key is held by law enforcement or whether it's held by a criminal who stole it from law enforcement. As we use the internet more and more for both commerce and, frankly, for storing our life, it's important that it be secure. And for it to be secure, we must be able to use encryption. We must be able to keep the keys safe. And sharing them with law enforcement agencies, either here in the United States or anywhere else in the world, will not lead to the internet remaining secure.
Thank you. So we met. We had our basic conclusion. Now we had to go off and justify this. We had our basic ideas, but the report had to be written. And we met in May, and we started working on it. And then we got word that there was going to be need to have this done soon, that it was going to be very important that we finish by the end of June to get into the national debate. So at that point, we all had our panic moments because we had been moving along at an academic pace, and it had to be accelerated. We got to work, we started working hard, and then we got a congressional reprieve of sorts. We learned of a Senate hearing that was going to be taking place on the issue on July 8th. Okay, so this gave us a one-week reprieve. We figured we don't have to publish on June 30th, we have to publish on July 7th and get it out ahead of the report. So this was good for most of us. It presented a bit of a challenge for a couple of us because I had been working for 2 years on another report that was due out June 30th and had also gotten a one-week reprieve. And Ron Rivest was also part of this effort. So in the first week of July, there was a lot of mail going back and forth. And in particular, it was a kind of surreal situation for me as I was reading Ron's comments on government access to keys and replying, and then I turn and read some comment that Ron makes about verifiable election technologies to another group, and I reply to Ron's comment there, and then back and forth. And we got busy on this. So as things went forward, I should give you a bit of a sense of our timetable. So July 8th was a Senate hearing. That meant the report had to be out the morning of July 7th. This meant that really it had to be out and available. We had to be done by July 6th because we needed to have at least a day for careful proofreading, get everything done, and also share the essentially finished report with key people who might need to have it. So that really meant that by the end of July 5th, everything had to be done, except maybe for grammar corrections and things of that sort. Now, in that context, we were really rushing to get a lot of things done. I remember that the morning of July 5th, during July 4th, we all had an interesting July 4th weekend, except for Ross Anderson, who's in the UK. Maybe it was a normal weekend for him. But one thing that happened on July 4th was, hey, we don't have an abstract for this report. So I remember I wrote and dropped in an abstract into the document on early the morning of July 5th, about 1:30 Pacific time, when I knew everybody else would be asleep, so that I'd have the document to myself for a little while. And I went to sleep, and that morning people seemed to like it. It doesn't mean it didn't change a lot. People changed it a lot, but we had the abstract in. But then the afternoon of July 5th, Danny sent out a note saying, we could really use a title for this thing. We all remembered that the title for the previous report kind of sucked. There wasn't really a good way to refer to this. So we had this sudden issue, and I thought about it some and tried a few things, and after a while I came up with this metaphor of leaving a key under the doormat. And I was really pleased with this metaphor. I thought this was really good because this captured the notion of you feel like you're secure, your door is locked, you've given access to somebody else who might need access, but pretty much anybody might be able to figure out, hey, there's a key there, and you have this false sense of security. And this seemed to be a metaphor for the false sense of security that we find if we build in backdoors or escrow systems or something else into internet and technologies. So I proposed this, I was very happy with this, and of course everybody else hated it. And we tried a bunch of things and kicked things around, and after a little while we started coming back to this, although it started to morph. No key under the doormat, keys under the doormat, keys under doormats, etc. And we got to that evening, and at this point, what had happened so many times happened again. I urge you, if you ever have 15 or 14 co-authors on a paper, you need to have somebody like Danny Whitener. Because Danny had just the right touch. He would listen, everybody would have their discussions, and at a certain point, he would finally say, okay, let's go with keys under doormats, and we'd move on. And at that point, some people still hated the title, but it was okay. We moved on. We all respected Danny. This was a good way to work. We could have argued about this forever. It wasn't necessarily the majority opinion. It wasn't necessarily even the best decision, but it's a good decision. Let's make it and let's move on, keep things moving. And that really helped the process tremendously. So this is how we were able to get this far. Now, we had a pleasant July 6th. We all did our rereads. We made minor changes and didn't have to work that hard. And then on July 7th at 9 a.m., the report was issued. July 7th at 9:01 a.m., the article appeared on the New York Times webpage. Nice picture here that we have of Peter Neumann. The New York Times Science Times ran a spread on Peter a few years ago, so I think they had some extra pictures available. So it's nice to have that. And we read this, and we started listening to other media, started getting picked up elsewhere. It seemed to be going pretty well. And then late in the day on July 7th, we heard this is going to be on the front page of the Times tomorrow. Oh, this is surprising. We had expected to get some attention, but this was more attention than we had expected. And we also heard something interesting. What we were told was this meant that the article would have to be rewritten and dumbed down a bit, because what you can put on the front page of the New York Times might not be as technical as what you might be able to put on the webpage and whatnot. So I, and I imagine others, spent the evening of July 7th hoping that the world stayed really quiet, because nobody start a war, please, because we're going to get bumped right away. And went to sleep, got up the next morning, went to the doorstep, and I found this. So yes, we were on the front page, and not only on the front page, but I don't know if you can see it up there, but top of column 1. Wow. This is a lot more attention than any of us expected, but it was great, moving forward. And then we all turned on the webcast of the Senate hearings that were going that morning, and there were lots of comments during the hearings about this report and related things. And something happened during the hearings that long-timers told us they'd never seen before, which is the FBI position seemed to change from what had been the previous day. The FBI position had been kind of nebulous, but had been, we want access to the keys. We want to be able to decrypt data. And it changed, and it became after that more of, no, it's okay if vendors keep the keys. We just need to be able to serve a court order, get a warrant, and get access to data that way, which is narrower. It's certainly better. It's certainly more manageable, but still has problems, and we've talked about those problems. There are other things that seem to change. It became clear during the hearings that even though FBI and law enforcement wanted access to all data information, their main concern was if they arrest somebody who's carrying a mobile device, they really want to be able to read what's on that mobile device. Okay? The other things would be nice too, but that seems to be their priority. And there may be things that can be done in that space, but it's difficult. But FBI Director Comey was also very shrewd in this. Instead of doing what was done 20 years before with Clipper and with, here's our technology, this is what we want to do, now go at it, it was, oh no, we're not proposing any specifics. You guys are smart. You figure out how to guess what we want. Well, I'm not that smart. I've tried. Maybe somebody else is smarter who can do this. Good luck. I genuinely hope that somebody could find a way, but I don't see it. I honestly don't think it's likely. So things continue. We've turned the paper into a Journal of Cybersecurity paper. There's a CACM article on this. With the change in emphasis, we learned recently from the Washington Post that the Obama administration has now decided not to pursue a legislative strategy. Now that's good, but it also means there's a bit of a behind the doors voluntary strategy here. And this is something we all need to be aware of. So before I close, I want to bring up two final co-authors. Susan Landau I want to mention specifically, because Susan was not one of the original 11. We went from 11 to 15. It sounds like we added a lot of people, but not so much the way you might think. Danny Whitener was a part of the original report, but he decided to stay in the background because his affiliation was Center for Democracy and Technology at that time. He's now part of MIT, and we convinced him he could actually list himself as an author. He brought his student, Michael Spector, who did great work, not just organizational work, but technical work, and made major contributions. And Matt Green, finally, we brought in as a new expert. We brought him in very late in the process when we needed fresh eyes, and it was really helpful. He made great contributions, really helped liven things up. It was great. So the only new security and policy expert who we brought in at the start of this process was Susan. And frankly, I'm not sure how we wrote the report 20 years ago without her. She made tremendous contributions. And she wants to give her sense of the story of what happened here. So if we can cue up Susan.
So first I want to say how pleased and delighted we all are to win this award. We all find it a little bit ironic to be getting such an award from an anti-spam group while we're arguing for end-to-end and device encryption. And I think it just shows how important end-to-end encryption and device encryption have become. But we're thrilled that you see it that way too. So thank you very much. I know that you're interested in how it is we came together to write this, and a large part of the group had done a similar report 15 years ago during the first crypto wars, 18 years ago. And I think it was noodling around a bit in Danny Whitener's head. Danny and I were at a privacy meeting in February in DC, and he said, what did I think about doing such a thing? And I said, yeah, I thought it would be a good idea. And he said he thought we should have some new people. He wondered if I was interested. He asked around who else we might add. One of the people we added was Matt Green, because Matt has been blogging a lot on these issues. Various of us have been thinking about these issues in the interim since the first report. Whit Diffie and I wrote a book on the issues. Matt Blaze, Steve, and I have been writing a number of papers on the security risks of embedding surveillance within communications infrastructures. Bruce, of course, has been writing numbers of books on this area, on security risks and security theater. Ross has been thinking hard about economics of information security. Josh, who is speaking to you later, or speaking to you now, Josh has been working on voting and the security risks there, all of which are related, but all of us have been thinking in various ways about these problems for a long time. So it was natural that we would all come together and work on it. The way we did it is we had some meetings by email, and then a subset of us met in New York with, I remember Ron Skyping in from Boston, Ross Skyping in from England. We're all used to working in a distributed fashion, so that worked quite well. We came up, after we noodled around during the daytime, we came up with a reasonable outline. And then a couple of us were at a meeting where somebody from the government said to us, this by now is early June of this year, someone from the government said, you know, we could really use some expert advice and we need it quickly. So at that point, we moved into high gear. And again, because we've all worked on papers where one of us does one piece, one of us does another, and nobody's in the same location, we were sending mail madly back and forth. And we know how to criticize each other. We know how to criticize each other quite sharply at times. But because we've all had working relationships with each other over the last decades, it was a pretty easy relationship. You know, even when the arguments got strong, they were never difficult. And then when we released the paper, we were thrilled, of course, to have the New York Times coverage. We were watching, many of us were watching the hearings, and we would get mail back and forth. Did you see Leahy cited our report? Did you see what they said about our report? And we were really pleased to have the impact at the Senate hearings because of the course, the issues we're raising, the issues about security risks. When you embed surveillance into communications infrastructure, when you embed it into apps, when you require that devices have exceptional access, when you require that sort of thing, it's really dangerous for our society. It's dangerous for corporations, it's dangerous for individuals, it's dangerous for the government. It's dangerous for national security. So we were really pleased to see the attention the report drew. We're also really pleased to see that various people like Chertoff and Hayden have moved in our direction. It's not surprising. There was precedent for that move, of course, in the change in the export controls in 2000. So even while law enforcement and the FBI were not thrilled by the change in export control regulations, which of course made it easy to do encryption domestically. Clearly, the National Security Agency was behind that change, or that change wouldn't have happened in 2000. You didn't see the change in product until post the Snowden disclosures. But that change would happen at some point was clear to the national security apparatus. Nonetheless, we're really pleased to see the official or unofficial statements by people who have been in high levels in the government, including in the Department of Homeland Security, and as the NSA director, endorsing the position that we've taken. So we're very pleased with the direction.
And then finally, we have Hal Abelson. Hal is always somebody who is thinking a step ahead and keeping us honest about things. And he has some very brief thoughts on where we are and where we're going on this. So if we could cue Hal.
Well, there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of concern that we're about to get into a security crisis. But what people need to realize is that we're in a security crisis and that our information infrastructure is extremely vulnerable. The last thing we need right now are efforts to make that infrastructure even less reliable. And the worst possible way to do that is by trying to undercut the actual basic technology on which our security depends.
Okay, so just to close things up, we're certainly very happy that there's no legislation forthcoming immediately, but the charge to all of you, here's where you come in and you can help, at least those of you in industry, or especially those of you in industry, is there's going to be some of this arm twisting of trying to encourage voluntary compliance. And you're the security experts or related experts, you're the technical experts, and when the salespeople are coming and talking about, here's this big deal that we can do if only we agree to X, Y, and Z. I encourage you to encourage your companies to take a long-term view and think, yeah, there might be a sale here, but we could be killing the golden goose if we start building in the kind of access in our systems that other countries may not be building in and our customers may not want. So as you go back, try to keep that in mind, and hopefully we'll be able to maintain good civil liberties and a good balance with law enforcement at the same time. So thank you all, and thank you especially. This is really special.